if someone would ask, how do I get involved with the methods group? What would you answer?
So at the moment, our conveners are made up of representatives from those 4 organizations, from Cochrane, from Campbell, JBI, and the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, because the remit of the methods group is around guiding implementation in those 4 organizations. So in terms of kind of wider membership, we don't have any roles at the moment, but we are considering how we might engage with those that are interested in the work that we do. So we might be setting up newsletters, etc., in the future. But what we would encourage people to do is, if you are interested in this topic, is to join the International Collaboration of Automation in Systematic Review. So Anna mentioned this collaboration earlier to ICASAR or ICESA. So we can pop a link to that in the chat for anyone who is interested.
Okay, thank you. There was some questions also regarding copyright issues, copyright limitations. I read just one of them, but it basically covers also the other ones. With regards to the promise of faster data extraction, how do we get over the copyright limitations? I.e. the existing license not allowing the use of AI tools on the full text of papers.
So I'm happy to go first.
Who wants to take this one?
Yeah, so I think every like there are global conversations about this going on, right? It's something that as a field we need to address. There are discussions happening with kind of publishers and kind of understanding like where we sit at the moment. I think my recommendation would be to kind of err on the side of caution. I think this is for the moment. You want to make sure that if you have copyrighted content, that you do not breach copyright by uploading it into an AI tool. But that doesn't mean that the field won't evolve. This is a new, there might be a kind of, this is an active area that lots of people are working in. So I'm sure there'll be kind of developments that will help facilitate some of these things, because, a lot of this is coming from funders, it's coming from users in terms of there's more, to meet up to meet the demand of the funders and the users, we need to change how we do things. So I would say err on the side of caution for now, but keep an eye out for future developments in the field. But James has got his hand up, I can see.
Yeah, no, I agree. Just to add to that, I think that there are 2 aspects to it. And I think one of the important things to bear in mind is that publishers are not sort of just neutral in this. They're actually overclaiming in terms of what they can restrict people from doing with their content. But at the same time, they're quite right to be saying that we shouldn't be uploading copyrighted content to tools which in their terms and conditions are saying we're going to take this and use it to improve our models, because we don't have the rights to do that with their content. Having said that, there are lots and lots of terms and conditions on publishers' websites that basically say if you use something from my website, you're not allowed to even process it through a language model. And that actually is running counter to certainly the copyright exemptions, for example, in the UK and the EU around data mining for non-profit enterprises. So if you're doing something that's just not for profit, you actually do have the right to process things like that, but you don't have the right to then hand it over for subsequent use. So we do have to be quite careful about that little nuance there. But we also have to be aware that publishers are trying to stop us doing stuff which actually we should be allowed to do. So we have quite a fine line to tread.
No. All right. Let's continue. Another question, it's the 3rd one. I'm wondering if the team has any guidance on reporting AI tools used together, ideas, terms, potentially relevant papers for a scoping review search.
So there is so is this around a reporting framework, or is it around, that's what I think the question is about. So within RAISE 2, which is the kind of the second paper, there is a reporting framework for AI tool evaluation. Some of the things that the AI tool developers should be considering when it comes to reporting their evaluations, so that a user has the information they need to make that kind of informed decision as to whether or not that they should use it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about scoping reviews is that, you know, some of the, you know, the expectations around searching 20, 30 databases and things are sort of toned down a little bit for some of this work. And, you know, some of these tools look really good for doing quick searches, getting a good scope of the literature and understanding what's there. And I think there we need people who are interested in trying these things to evaluate what they're seeing and what the sort of like the strengths and weaknesses of the tools are. Because as I said earlier about publication bias, if we have tools which just magnify that, even if they're just scoping reviews, then, you know, there's a balance of benefit and harm to be considered here. And at the moment, we don't have the evidence base to, you know, to say one way or the other. So if you're doing a scoping review using one of these tools, then have a think about how we might learn from, you know, for the future from that activity.
Okay, thanks. So let's go on. The fourth one is in RAISE item 1.7. You state evidence synthesists should not treat a chatbot, e.g. ChatGPT, as a knowledge base for evidence synthesis tasks. That is, do not rely on it for factually accurate answers. Is it acceptable to use AI chatbot prompts to query a file folder of article PDFs to extract data, provided the synthesist then checks each article that the extracted data is accurate?
Shall I do that
Go for it, James.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, so first of all, yes, weirdly enough, I agree with the RAISE guidance 1.7 there, that a language model is not a knowledge base. It sort of can make itself look like a knowledge base, but that's, you know, what the types of questions and answers we're often interested in are not frequently found in the literature often. And so those are the answers which are most likely not to be correct when you query a language model. So we don't use them like that. Yes, language models look, you know, anecdotally, they look quite good at extracting information out of a PDF file. We need more research to know how reliable they are at doing that. But that's something which we'd really like to see develop, because, you know, there's potentially big gains there. The question is then really interesting because it's talking about a folder of PDFs. And so you know, in terms of how much you can feed a language model at a time and how much it can sort of, you know, sensibly cope with, is probably not a folder of hundreds of PDFs. And sometimes the tools that can cope with this for you basically sort of chop your PDFs up into sort of small sections, index them using a language model. When you ask, you know, when you query it, they look through what's been indexed, the little chunks, and identify the chunks that look as though they answer your question, and then answer your question. And so we have to be really careful when we're using that kind of system, because on the face of it, they often are very quick. They give you what looks like the right answer from the right PDF, and you think, wow, this is amazing. But, you know, in terms of thinking about the principles that underpin systematic reviews, they're not necessarily looking at all of the right documents to find those answers. You know, we don't know how far down the list it should look, or it might be them sort of polluting the answers with irrelevant bits from documents. And so we've got multiple things to consider there. There's the retrieval of the right document, and then whether or not the right information is retrieved from the right document. And we just don't know. There are lots of tools which look all very interesting, very powerful. When you start to look under the hood and start to sort of, you know, sort of look and see the detail, then actually what we find often is that they're not doing it in a sort of like a way that we would if we were doing a systematic review.
Okay, great. There are some questions also regarding accuracy and transparency, and I would like to continue with this one. Acceptable accuracy standards for AI tools. In my experience, one tool may perform better for systematic reviews than for scoping reviews, or better in one domain than in another. Are the standards general or particular?
It's unmuted. Go on, Anna.
Well, I was just going to say it's a really great question, and it's one of the sort of key things that when we were setting out that we had to really think very carefully about, because it is obviously a very correct observation to assume that models are going to perform better in certain domains than others potentially, or in other contexts. The guidance is general, but what we do say in sort of, for example, in RAISE 3, where there's a sort of tool assessment form for people to use, is when you're looking at a potential tool and you're looking at its validation, one of the key things is really to look at whether or not you think it will work well in the context in which you wish to use it. And, you know, at the moment now, a lot of the evaluation studies that we come across, they've been done in quite narrow contexts. They're very small studies, underpowered potentially. So we're not yet able to generalize to other domains necessarily. So it is a really key point to consider.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add as well that this was, this is one of the areas that we really kind of encourage tool developers to have more public information about, because the scope of the tool will work best dependent on the data that we'll use to train the tool. So if you can understand the domains that were included in the training data and the testing data, you'll have a clearer idea of the of any limitations or strengths, when it might work better, areas it might work better, areas it might not work as well, and have a kind of a clearer understanding on generalizability. And I think that's really important, that having these different areas publicly available from the tool developers is what's really important for making these decisions.
Thanks so much. I have another very great one, and it's about public and patient involvement. It is a great group of people on that international group. Will you consider including public and patient involvement representation for the future, please? It's a comment, but we can also understand it as a question. Do you plan to do so?
I think the approach, we identified I want to say 8 roles in this ecosystem. And I think what was really important was, when we were developing these recommendations, was to make sure that we had involvement and feedback from those 8 roles. But in terms of kind of evolving the authorship to have more patient and public involvement, I think the user of the evidence synthesis might be a patient or a member of the public. So they do need to understand the implications of AI use on a synthesis, so that they, can make their informed decisions. So I think it's a really good point, because they would fall underneath that kind of user umbrella of evidence synthesis. So yeah, it's a big group of people, but we're continuing to evolve it to make sure that it represents everyone.
Okay. In case nobody wants to add something here, perfect, Ella. And I would like to give you probably the last question of this webinar, and it is about transparency and reproducibility. It is key that systematic reviews are replicable and transparent. However, when using certain Gen AI models, these provide different answers to the same question or prompt. What is the recommendation around this? Who wants to go first?
Nobody's unmuted. Shall I have a go? And then maybe there's several people who could answer this question. I think it's a very good question because these models are designed not to necessarily give the same answer to the same input. I think there's two aspects to this. One is that obviously it depends on the task that you're using it for. We use language models for classification tasks as well as sort of generating text tasks. And there the question is whether or not the answer sort of changes the classification that's being given to a given piece of research, or it's sort of a piece of metadata or a tag that's being added. So whilst you might get a little bit of variability, the question is there significant variability which actually then makes it unreliable as a tool? Which if it does, then you just can't use it. And then there's the situations where we're using them to generate text, where we're summarizing interventions, or there are some interesting research studies now using them to write summaries of systematic reviews, for example. And here, what's really critical is the wording that is used to sort of identify, to describe an intervention or a review may change between one run and another, but does it actually change in the meaning? And there it's really, really difficult to evaluate these things at scale, because the only real way of doing it is to actually manually check, and a manual check of something like that involves a number of steps and it takes time. I think what I would urge us to be careful about are some of these automated checks, which use sort of blue and rouge scores, as they're called, because we've sort of validated that in one little study we did, and we found that those scores were completely different to the sort of like the human assessed scores as to whether or not something was saying the same thing. So we have to be quite careful both of whether or not it's saying the right thing, but also validation studies which use some of these metrics which themselves may not be valid. There's some interesting work then also on validating the output of a language model using another language model, and that may be a good idea. But that's why we need an evidence base, because at the moment we just don't know.